So continuing with the late imperial age and some of the problems that the empire started to provide, especially in Africa. There's one more story, the story also from South Africa, happening at the very end of Victoria's life and in the first years of the 20th century. And this is the Boer War. South Africa was a particularly tricky place in the British Empire because there were the natives who tried to defend their lands, and especially the tribe of the Zulus were very well organized and they had a very strong military tradition. So in the, I think it was 1871, I guess, if I'm not mistaken, anywhere early 70s definitely. What happened was that Britain got involved in some local war with the Zulus, and the British Army with their brand new machine guns suffered the greatest defeat in the history of the British Empire at a place in the middle of nowhere. Been there, it's in the middle of nowhere, called Isandlwana. And they were defeated very, very bitterly, like completely decimated, by the Zulu warriors with shields and spears, mostly. So this was, again, a kind of dark legend of the British Empire, putting in doubt the strong belief that the British Army was the best in the world, they were invincible, and everyone else was definitely bound to lose if they wanted to rebel against the British. And suddenly we have those, by the British standards, primitive black tribesmen who defeat the best army in the world, not even having rifles, or just a few. They mostly had spears, so it's like, you know, medieval warriors defeating the most modern army in the world. This was something. This hurt. I think it really hurt. And definitely later on they were a little bit more cautious in praising their superiority to high heavens. The next problem in South Africa were the Boers. The Boers were Dutch colonists, kind of German Dutch, let's say, colonists. They had close connections with Germany, and after the unification of Germany, they believed that they were the allies of Germany. They were mostly farmers, and they were also trying to get a kind of foothold in South Africa at the same time as the British. This resulted in a very messy situation, so a kind of three-sided war with the British, the Zulus and the Boers. So we have all kinds of battles between different combinations. So the Boers versus the Zulus, the Boers versus the English versus the Zulus, and you have all these combinations. And at the end of the 19th century, the war was generally getting messy, with much of the civilian population being Boer farmers, not involved in the military conflict, but providing some sort of help and food and other services to the Boer side. So what the British decided to do was to establish a completely new thing. They came up with a new invention, and the new invention was called concentration camps. One of the officers, very young, officer who was involved in this whole thing was called Winston Churchill. So you may imagine what the Germans made of it in the 1930s. The concentration camps were, as the term suggests, meant for the relocation and temporary housing of the civilian population so that they would not provide food and shelter to the Boers. They were not meant to be extermination camps, but because they were hastily organized, the management and food and other aspects of the administration of the camps was getting poorer in time. So what happened was high mortality rates among the people held in the camps because of malnutrition and all kinds of epidemic diseases. So this was something that the press in Britain tried to keep quiet for a long time, but they couldn't really for forever, and this was again another scandal involving the British military, involving a failed myth that the British were always very chivalrous and noble in combat, and they never attacked the civilian population. So by the end of Victoria's reign and by the end of the 19th century, many myths regarding the empire that were seen as very positive by, especially by people living in England, were disproved, and they turned into a very bitter disappointment. It's even hard to say who won the Boer War in the end, because it was so dirty and so bloody and so against all the proper rules of combat. So what we have as the result is, of course, the dissolution of the empire in the 20th century, with the financial crisis after the two world wars, with the global domination of the United States. We have basically the second half of the 20th century is the time of great problems of the British Empire, with important places like India dropping off, creating their own problems with the division between India and Pakistan, with some more problems including the British presence in Palestine, with the Suez Crisis in the 1950s, all along to the Irish Troubles, so the virtual civil war in Ireland, and things like the Falklands War, and some say the last moment of the dissolution of the British Empire was handing over Hong Kong to China in 1997. Another thing that was left was, of course, perhaps some good things after all. The Commonwealth, the international organization, and the Commonwealth Games, so they have like their own Olympics. The infrastructure, especially the railways, education, system of justice, the transformation of the English language into a global phenomenon, and basically the global language, and also quite a lot of intellectuals, mostly intellectuals from the former colonies, writing interesting critiques of the British colonialism, of generally this kind of colonial mentality and the whole post-colonial studies. This wouldn't have really happened without this whole thing. Perhaps the most important of the post-colonial scholars would be Edward Said, a British, well, he was born in British-occupied Jerusalem in what he called an Arab Christian family. And his most important book, translated into many languages, is called Orientalism. And this is about the ways that the Western world perceives the Orient, so the Middle East mostly. And you cannot really understand the modern world without knowing something about the British Empire in the 19th century and the criticism of the colonial mindset later on in the second half of the 20th century. So Orientalism, for example, is a kind of attitude in which, because Said mostly used 19th century examples, 19th century literature, 19th century painting, showing the Arab countries, the Middle East. And the way that the Orient, as the Westerners would call it, was shown in these works of art was on one hand very attractive and beautiful and romanticized. So we have very beautiful, sexy women, but they are weak and they definitely need protection. And the men there, they are very masculine and sexy, but at the same time they are a bit irrational and wild and perhaps dangerous. So all the stereotypes that surround, especially the Middle East, can be traced back to the 19th century in the way that painters and novelists and poets described the Orient. On one hand, showing it in a positive light as romanticized and fascinating. On the other hand, legitimizing the white man's burden. So people there are wild and irrational and violent and sexually easy. So they need the intervention from the more civilized countries, especially Britain. So the stereotypes and the problems and the lack of perspective given to the former colonized people is really another subject. We could talk about Stuart Hall and Homi Bhabha and Gayatri Spivak writing about the post-colonial view from the perspective of the former colonies, and this is one of the aspects of the British Empire. I hope you get something out of it. It was very, very quick. As I said, if you want more, watch those documentaries or read one of the books, and that's it for this week. We have one more subject to cover, and this is the Edwardian period. Thank you.